Welcome to session 13. Today we'll be talking about the death and resurrection of Christ. The Gospel of Mark, we hear these words. They were on their way to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock and spit on him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Again, these are going to be some of the more familiar terrain stories of Jesus. But these are great stories, the centerpiece of the message of Jesus and of the good news for us just to be able to express and share the story again. Today we'll just begin the story with Jesus' experience on the Mount of Transfiguration. This event happens towards the end of his ministry as he is nearing his death, and he takes 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he goes up on the mountain, and there he is transfigured in their presence. Along with Jesus appear Moses and Elijah, and they have a conversation. The conversation is about the exodus of Jesus, or the departure of Jesus. In other words, here we have 3 incredible historical figures talking about the death of Jesus. And after that experience is over, Peter steps up and suggests that they enter into a little building program and build 3 shelters, one for each of them, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And a cloud covers the scene, and the voice from the cloud, God speaking from the cloud, says, "This is my son, hear him." And so in this grand experience, the tone is really set for all of the future and further activity of Jesus to be moving toward the crucifixion. Not long after that, Jesus and his disciples go to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. And so they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus sends a couple of his disciples on ahead, and they are charged with the responsibility of finding a donkey's colt, bringing that back to Jesus. They do so. They throw their cloaks on it. Jesus riding on the colt comes into Jerusalem. The people have heard about his coming, and many of them throw their cloaks down on the ground in front of him. Many of them get palm leaves and throw them down. And Jesus comes in to Jerusalem with a great crowd, expressing their hosannas toward him, and the hope that God had sent him to be their Messiah. Several days later, Jesus was in the village or the town of Bethany, and he was at the home of Simon the leper, and while he was there, a woman comes in, and she has with her alabaster box of very expensive and precious perfume. She breaks it and pours it over the head, body, and feet of Jesus. And the disciples are witnessing all of this, and they are certainly dismayed by this incredible act of love and extravagance. And there is some criticism coming from the disciples that this is something of a waste, that this woman should have or could have sold that expensive perfume and given the money to the poor. And Jesus' response to that is that she had come, and by pouring this perfume on him had prepared his body for burial. So several times, just right up to this, Jesus has announced the fact that he is going to Jerusalem, that when he gets there, that he will suffer and that he will die and that he will be raised again. This had become a very difficult kind of thing for the disciples to hear. They were unsure of this. They didn't know quite what to do with it, and as you might know, Peter himself offered something of a rebuke to Jesus that certainly he would not die. So Jesus has really set the ground for his coming into Jerusalem, for what in fact is going to happen there. He has told his disciples in advance of the activities that will happen concerning his death and resurrection. He has been anointed by this woman who comes in, and while the scene is while the scene is unfolding with this woman and she is pouring precious ointment on Jesus, that across the way at the home of Caiaphas, the high priest and the teachers of the law and some of the leaders of the Jews are meeting together. And as they meet together, they are plotting how they can take Jesus and kill him. So you have these two incredible scenes kind of side by side, as if they were happening, if they were not so, happening simultaneously. Jesus is being anointed for the death that is to come, and at the same time, there is a very powerful and significant group of people who are plotting his demise and his death. After the anointing of Jesus by this woman, Judas goes off to Caiaphas and catches up with this gathering of people and offers to identify or to release Jesus to them. And so a deal is cut, and Caiaphas gives 30 pieces of silver to Judas, who in a subsequent moment will identify and betray Jesus over to the religious authorities. So, evening comes for the day of Passover, and Jesus sends several of his disciples again to a particular room in which the Passover meal is going to be had. When the meal is prepared and Jesus gets there, at the end of the meal itself, Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it and he passes it among his disciples. And in so doing, he tells them that he too will be broken. And as they each are passed their bread, or they take their part of the bread, Jesus instructs them to take it and eat it together. And then Jesus takes the cup of wine and he passes that around to the disciples, and he instructs them to drink that, for it would be the blood of his, or represent the new covenant. So in a very powerful and dramatic way, Jesus has once again depicted and portrayed his death, this time not only in words, but in a beautiful symbol, using the bread and the wine. While he was doing all of this, and even before he passed the bread and the cup of wine, Jesus said to the disciples that there would be one among them who would in fact betray him. So after the meal itself, they sing a hymn, they go out, into the Mount of Olives. They make their way to a garden place, to Gethsemane. And while they are in Gethsemane, Jesus begins to pray. He is in stress as he enters into this prayer. Again, he has had Peter, James, and John with him, and he just off a short distance. And while Jesus is praying, they're tired, sleepy, and so Jesus is just alone, about to enter this incredible battle of accepting that which is coming at him in just a short amount of time. His soul is overwhelmed. And in his prayer, he prays that the cup of death that he knows that he is about to drink would pass from him if at all possible. Yet, his prayer is that whatever the will of his Father is, will indeed be what he does. So, on the one hand, knowing the pain, the sorrow, knowing the kind of death that he is about to enter into, realizing how agonizing, and the fact that in this death there will be separation between the Son, Jesus, and his Father, and that he will be bearing in himself the sin of the world. Jesus is certainly asking for the cup, that kind of cup, to pass from him, but he surrenders himself completely, abandons himself to the will of God, and in a sense, in that time of prayer and in that deep connection with God and all that Jesus is experiencing, Jesus submits himself fully to the will of his Father. Later on that evening, religious leaders arrive, and they come with swords and clubs. The Roman soldiers are with them, and Judas steps out, and with a kiss he betrays Jesus, and Jesus is seized, and he is taken to the palace area. Judas, seeing how Jesus was condemned, takes the 30 pieces of silver, which was the blood money given to him, takes it back to the religious leaders, and then he goes off into a field where he hangs himself. Jesus is taken before Pilate, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of that time, asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus' response to that is, "You say so." So Pilate, hearing that his Jewish counterpart, who is ruling in the northern area of Galilee, Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, is in town, and there had been enmity and estrangement between them for some years, sends Jesus over to Herod. Herod seeks to question him, sends Jesus back, and Pilate then brings Jesus to the public, to the crowds that have assembled, to the Jewish crowd. Pilate himself has found no evidence that would warrant the death of Jesus, that he claims to be a Messiah is really not, in the view of Pilate, something that would necessitate the death of Jesus. However, when the charge now is leveled that Jesus is a distractor, that Jesus could revolt and that he could turn all of this against Rome, Pilate now would be much more interested in what should be done with Jesus. And so Pilate, torn between what to do, and the truth is really not finding anything that he can just ultimately stake the fate of Jesus on in such a way as crucifixion, brings the matter to the people. And religious leaders, teachers of the law, kind of sway the crowd as Pilate presents to them a traditional option that is done at Passover each year, a right or privilege that is given to the governor, and that is that there would be the release of one criminal. And so Pilate offers the choice between the release of Barabbas, well-known criminal, or the release of Jesus. The crowd has been excited by the religious leaders, and they have pulled the energy of the crowd, and they actually get the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas. At that point, Pilate says to the crowd, "What then shall I do with Jesus?" And the crowd begins to shout loudly, "Crucify him, crucify him." And so Jesus is taken, and Barabbas is released. Jesus is whipped, he's spat upon, he is mocked, a purple robe is put on him, a crown of thorns is meshed on his head, and he becomes the object of ridicule as the path now is open toward the reality that Jesus is going to be crucified. From there, Jesus is taken to Golgotha, just outside the city. When they get there on a Friday morning, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Jesus is crucified. His hands have been nailed to a cross, as well as his feet. He is still mocked by those who come. His followers are in a panic. His mother and several of the women who had provided material ministry to Jesus are in attendance, and they are standing there, and they are taking all of this in. And at noontime, as this process continues to unfold, clouds fill the sky, and darkness covers the entire area and region from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus breathes his last words, or his last breath, with the words, "It is finished." The curtain or the veil in the temple is torn from top to bottom. There is an earthquake, and Jesus' death now has been complete. Joseph of Arimathea is one of those who had heard and presumably followed the story of Jesus, and he actually makes a very bold and daring move by going to Pilate and asking for the body of Jesus. Joseph has a tomb in which the body of Jesus can be placed. Pilate releases the body of Jesus to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph wraps the body in linen. He takes him to the tomb that he owns, that has been cut in rock, and he lays Jesus in the tomb. The women who had been at the crucifixion have followed along, and they know in which tomb the body of Jesus has been placed. The next day was a Sabbath day, a day which forbade travel and those kinds of things. But the next day, when the sun was rising in the early dawn, a number of women made their way to the tomb where they had seen Joseph place the body of Jesus. They go there to anoint his body, but in the early daylight as they get there, the stone is rolled away, and just prior to that, an angel had come down, and again, with earthquake and tremor, rolled the stone away. When the women get to the tomb, they see an angel sitting on the right side where the body of Jesus had previously lain. Then the angel declares to them that Jesus is not there, that he is risen just as he said he would be. And the angel commands the women to go and tell the disciples about this new reality of the resurrection of Jesus. The women rush off and tell the disciples, and a couple of disciples make their way, and they too enter the tomb and see that Jesus is gone. Later that evening, Jesus appeared to all of the disciples who, for fear of what the Romans might do to them or the Jewish leaders might do to them, were in hiding, and Jesus appears to them and shows them his hands, his feet, the visible evidence, the marks of the crucifixion that he has just gone through, and the incredible reality that he has been risen from the dead. Jesus also appears to other followers of his over the next number of days, and before Jesus returns to the Father, he commands the disciples to go and make disciples across the entire world, and that he would be with them as they engaged in that mission. And they are to do so in the name, and baptize in the name, teach in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.